Okay, good evening, everyone, and happy Pride. I forgot to say this last time, but I remember this time. It's Pride Month, which is fantastic. We are here in Paris. Some of you were already are repeating students. Some of you are new, so I'm going to give you a little spiel of who we are and what we're doing. I'm Alfredo Spagna. I'm in the psychology department at Columbia University. Here visiting for 4 weeks with 14 undergraduate students from the Arts and Sciences at Columbia University. You can raise your hand so that people can locate you. There you go. Here they are. Thank you. We're here studying neuroscience-related content, as well as visiting the Paris Brain Institute. And we have this evening with us some of the principal investigators. I'm going to start from left to right. We have Liane Schmidt. So your lab has a very long name. Do you have an acronym, or do you want to tell us the whole name? Interoception, Cognition, Attention. Lab. Right, there you go. No acronym. All right. There you go. Okay, and then we have Antoni Valero Cabré from the front lab. Can we shorten it from front lab? You cannot shorten it more. Not more than that, okay. Much of an important lobe in the brain, make it shorter. There you go. So for the very long front lab, and then we have the scientific director of ICM as well, Bassem Hassan. From the fruit fly lab, is there a short lab? We want the long one, okay. Neurodevelopmental lab, thank you. All right, as you all know, this is a conversation on consciousness, and it means that we want you all to be kind of in conversation with these fantastic scientists. They all work on different areas. We will let you kind of discover what areas they're actually interested in, research areas they're interested in. And the scope is, again, to ask all sorts of questions and have them discuss some of the most important topics. Last week, we were talking about kind of the past and the future of neuroscience. This week, I would like to gear a little bit our conversation towards ethics in neuroscience, just because, you know, we are studying this very important organ of the brain, right? And understanding how this organ works can open many doors towards more kind of curing, treatment, rehabilitation, but also just empowering people, doing things that are not usually able to do. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to start with Liane. And I'm going to sit down, and then I just tell you all now and for all that there's a button, the microphone, and if you want to talk, you have to be comfortable with like clicking. Perfect. All right, Liane, so you visited our class the other day, and first of all, it was such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. And also, you discussed a little bit about the work you're doing on placebo effects, on pain, and so on, and certainly discussing all this topic, right? Relate one-to-one with consciousness, right? So there was a study on water. Maybe do you want to introduce your water study a little bit and tell us how water can affect our consciousness?
Okay, this is ongoing work. So it's we only send it to one paper. We got major revisions, so that we need to work much more to get it through. So this is a placebo experiment. So we take the glass of water because basically we just want to have a placebo effect. And once we have this placebo effect, and we want a placebo effect in everyday life. So because usually placebo effects, you know them from clinical trials as a control arm for non-specific effects. But they're also very prominent in disease and in everyday life. So there's a big body of literature in consumer psychology that shows all these label effects on experiences and decisions. And so we wanted to study a placebo effect on everyday life, economic choices. And then once we have this effect, we want to study its mechanism. So economic choices propose certain cognitive mechanisms that we can formalize with mathematical models. And we can look with fMRI into the neural mechanisms. So that's the experiment all about.
For those that are interested, but don't really have a definition, what is a working definition of placebo? How do we call it?
That depends on what level actually you're studying it. You could study just as a clinical scientist, a clinical researcher. It's a control condition for non-specific effects. Anything could be like because the patient is in a clinical trial, is getting a drug, and that's why it's running, like trivial explanations, or effects like regression to the mean, statistical artifacts. But there are certain active processes that are less trivial that also contribute to placebo effects, such as expectancies, conditioning. These are the two big factors, basically. And these we want to better know. And when you then talk about placebo for cognitive neuroscientists, is actually something active that happens in the brain and in cognition, and that we want to harness. What is it? Is it cognitive regulation? Is it motivation? Is it only expectancy? Is it only conditioning? What brain regions are implicated? So that we can actually target them and control for them in clinical trials later on, like many years later, once we've harnessed them.
So is it ethical to do placebo studies? Basic question, simple question, but certainly.
For me, yes, because we need to know, right? We need to know before we treat patients with a treatment whether this treatment is going to work, and when the placebo effect is too strong, we don't know nothing. We cannot say anything about the treatment. So if we can understand not only like the pharmacological effects, but also the psychological effects of taking a drug, being under treatment, then we can make treatment more efficient. And in this sense, it's ethical to know actually what's going on when you implant, for example, patients with electrodes in the middle of the brain. You need to know what part of it is actually a placebo effect and why is it there before you go there.
That's awesome. It makes me think a lot about, kind of 20 years ago when we were enjoying fMRI a lot, then we realized that actually we were doing a little kind of trick to our data, which is excluding from our data or results the baseline activity of the brain, right? Thinking that baseline means like nothing or rest, right? What we call the resting state condition. And then we realized that actually within that resting state, there was so much, right? Resting state activity could explain how the brain works without having to do any certain task, right? And that was like when we realized, maybe our approach to the brain or the brains, and we will get there in a second. Don't look, I can feel the heat of the, we have a inside joke. You will get to the joke in a second. But, how much the placebo seems to be, studying the placebo seems to be doing something analogous, right? Just like understanding how basic processes work. And by basic, it means not simple. It means like when you touch the baseline of how, of the mechanism per se, to see then when something happens. So shall we discuss about the brain? Can you tell us about the story about the brain versus the brains?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me here. This is a lot of fun. I know nothing about consciousness, as you know.
But we disagree.
I can barely keep myself conscious most of the time, so yeah, I mean, it's actually very simple. It's the notion that, the sort of the big statement is there is no such thing as the brain, right? The brain. Obviously, everyone has a slightly different brain. So the only thing that exists in reality is a sort of a cloud of brains, right? And you can say, yeah, well, that's trivial and obvious, but actually it isn't, because the point is if you spend your time trying to understand the brain, you by definition eliminate everything that's variable to try to achieve some sort of at first we call it standardized, but in fact eventually at a sort of a more psychological and then social and then political level, it becomes not just a standardized but a platonized, an idealized brain, which of course means that anything that doesn't fit or deviates too much from whatever that idealized form of the brain is somehow disorderly or defective or whatever. So the consequences to this sort of what I like to call this pseudo-Platonic notion of the brain can actually be profound, I think, socially and politically and ethically as well. And so the real notion is then, if reality is that there is no such thing as the brain, there is just a huge number of individual brains, then the perspective from which we study the brain becomes definitionally the perspective of variation. And so then there is no such thing as a variation on a theme, variation is the theme. And I think when you now approach neuroscience, and in fact, any question I would suggest from this perspective of diversity being the key, being what is necessary, right? I mean, all of life exists because random variation exists. We tend to forget that, right? Then not only are your scientific perspectives different, but I would argue your potentially interpersonal, social, political perspectives become different. What is normal is diversity. What is normal is difference. What is normal is distribution, not the mean. The mean is an artificial construct of attempting to sort of push things towards a singular entity that we feel more comfortable to deal with. And so this is where that comes from. It's a simple reality, but that I think has profound implications.
How did you, tell us a little bit about how did you get to this conclusion? What do you do in your daily life or research life, right, to get to this point? What kind of evidence?
Yeah. So
Is that a good question, huh?
No, it's a great question. I'll
Do I get an A plus?
I'll pay you later. No. Actually, like many scientists in my generation, molecular biologists of my generation, really were trained in the early 90s as essentially as genetic determinists, right? I mean, if you were a molecular biologist working in things like C. elegans or Drosophila melanogaster, you know, the power of molecular genetics at that time was amazing. I mean, you could make mutations, sometimes changing a single base pair in the genome, and change the body plan of an organism, or later on, you know, its behavior and so on. So, you know, you sort of get trained in this environment, and you say, well, clearly every single base pair in the genome encodes something specific, and therefore, you know, all variation is genetic variation. Everything else is kind of add-ons, right? And so from that perspective, you say, okay, you might all remember the whole notion that we would sequence the human genome, and then we would be able to predict disease and tell you how long you're going to live and what, you know. Yeah, well, I mean, the human genome has been sequenced for 23 years now. You know, we still can't answer those questions. Not that that was useless, that's not what I'm saying. Anyway, so you start from that perspective, and you build a lab, and you start doing research from that perspective, trying to understand the sort of almost mathematical determinism of genetics for brain development and eventually behavior. And then you get confronted with the data. And the data say, actually, whatever I do to harmonize, homogenize, you know, alter this and alter that, sure, I can make predictions about how the mean will change, but I can never get rid of the variance. And I'm just, in order to preserve time, one day a student comes to my lab, to my office, and says about a problem we were trying to solve. The only way I can solve this problem is if I assume there's an underlying stochastic process going on in the brain. And this way I can explain not only what we see as an average, but actually also the variance around that average. Which of course you never arrive to by these sort of deterministic approaches. And I think that was the key day where I realized, okay, you know, not only did we solve the problem for that one study or that one paper, this actually was a sort of a watershed moment in my own thinking about how I approach my own science. And it was the day I began to see development, the genome, the encoding of genetic information, and then everything else from this perspective of variation, and from the fact that stochasticity and noise are, again, fundamental features of the world, and they are causal to the generation of variation, and that in fact determinism cannot possibly be at least genetic determinism cannot possibly be correct.
That is awesome. So Tony, what say you? What do you have to say about this? It turned a statistics class. It's like now we're talking about baseline processes and the mean and the average. This is fantastic. So, and you do on neurostimulation. So tell us everything. What do you say?
If I may address the congregation about this issue that was just put forward here. At the beginning of my career, I was very interested in the issue of plasticity, neuroplasticity. By definition, this concept, which is very powerful, and even if we think that it was ever forever, no, it's really in the late 70s that people started really showing people like John Cass, particularly, in mammals, that there was a lot of these borders between brain areas devoted to different type of senses or limbs that could be quite magmatic, could change quite rapidly according to the input experience and so on. And one of the things that I learned by this time, and I keep learning and relearning, is that not only there is a lot of variability and inter-individual variability, as Bassem just mentioned, but probably that we are also very variable from day to day, from hour to hour, and to second to second. So if you want to bring this idea to the extreme, we could even think about the variance that us as individual or our individual cells might suffer through the day, through the time. And I think if we bring that to the extreme just for the sake of the argument, I think people have, for example, these human brain projects that have been organized, either the American version of the European version. People have some people have been trying to mock this attempt, saying, does it make sense to really actually study connectome when we know that the connectome is really highly flexible and plastic, and therefore it's never the same? That's what came to my mind when I was listening to this guy elucubrating about this topic.
I see Liane is ready, so please.
It's funny because actually, so now we are moving in the science and more in the fact that effects are stochastic. So it's interesting because actually, way back actually in the Renaissance, people thought everything is determined. But actually, then came like much later Bayes and Laplace, who formalized like Bayes' theorem, bringing out that actually everything is stochastic. And it's funny that in science now we are at this point acknowledging that the variance actually matters and that we could formalize it by thinking about it in probabilistic terms. But it's like we're 21st century. How did it take so long actually? Whereas in everything else, like in society, we no longer think that everything is determined by some higher deity. we already think in probabilities. Humans think in probabilities. So it's interesting that in science now we think about, we now assume it actually.
I think another thing that I would like to add to what Bassem, before he replies, I know he's going to reply and fire back, is the fact that, when you work in molecular biology or genetics, or when you work in the fruit fly, with all my respects to the fruit fly, which are high, I just want to state that up front, you probably can allow yourself to work in very large numbers of individuals. Whereas when you work in cognitive neurosciences, and I'm sure that Liam will corroborate that, we are somehow, because of the time costs of putting together an experiment, having subjects like you go through the experiment and so on, we end up with very small cohorts. So I think it made sense in the past, given our limitations, to produce high quality, large amounts of data, that in the end we were pretty much ignoring, neglecting, putting under the rack, in a sense, all this variability, all these, outliers in our experiment, because we were very worrisome. We couldn't handle that by mass testing, right? Whereas probably in the field of you come from, that was...
Well, but the surprising thing is that, in fact, in those fields where people studying worms or fruit flies, you would find the majority of still sort of determinists, for lack of a better term, in terms of their vision of how at least how the brain develops, right? And even for many of them, their vision of how activity in the brain produces behavior, such that, for example, the labeled line hypothesis, right? For the idea that if you were able to see the connectome, and the precise pattern of connectivity from input to motor output and are able to somehow measure neural activity, someday we'll be able to predict the precise behavior from the combination of those two things. And I think that the problem isn't that I think that this day will never come. I think just waiting for that. I mean, it won't come not because of a technical reason, because it's a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about how the brain works. And yet it's precisely in those types of organisms where you could discredit that type of idea that you find a lot of people wanting to believe. And I just, me personally, I often wonder the extent to which this is, in the end, you mentioned, we're past this idea of a deity and so on. I think world events would suggest otherwise. Nevertheless, I wonder to what extent this kind of, idealistic thinking is in a way an intellectual remnant of this sort of fantastical, quasi-religious way of thinking. The desire to want to believe, for better or worse, I mean, everyone has the right to believe whatever they want, to want to believe that there is a structure, there is a logic, it's invariable, and this desire for this kind of comfort, I think. Because if everything is probabilistic, including the universe, even Einstein had trouble with quantum mechanics, right? So it is a difficult thing. I mean, you have to live your life basically with the notion that, yeah, there's some stochastic probability that something may or may not happen, that the world is or is not, or whatever. And just to renounce the desire for certainty seems to be a very, very difficult psychological barrier. People want to know. They want something to blame. They want a cause. They want a reason for everything. And the more precise that reason is, somehow the more comfortable they are. And asking people, including scientists, to give that up seems to be difficult. So I would suggest that this is not a problem of evidence, data, type of organisms you work on. I think it's a foundational problem of human psychology, and science is just a human endeavor, like everybody else, like everything else, sorry. And so in that sense, why would it not be subject to the same social, psychological, and political issues that the rest of human society is subject to?
That's awesome. And that's said from someone that said, I don't know anything about consciousness. And then you said something so interesting, right? So just to give some context to our friends in the room, and I know that some already raised their hand because they wanted to ask questions. So we're reading all your papers in class, already. Today, our students were kind of questioning the validity of, a study with only 3 lesion patients, right? Which is a study from one of our co-authors, the one in the middle, Tony. But anyway, so they were like, only 3 people, how can you generalize? And I was like, go find 3 people with focal lesion and that behavior. Like, maybe there's 7 in the entire planet. Like, maybe 3 is a lot. And actually, a student said something that was very smart. It was like, but don't focus on this paper as only 3 people in their sample size. The question was like, how can you say that 3 people generalize? Like, just think about, well, this is the first 3. You published something now. You took a snapshot in history about these 3 individuals and how they behaved. And then let 20 more years of looking for people with that specific lesion add up onto the knowledge and trying to go in a direction that is not mean, but is also diversity. And I'm saying this just to fold you in because we also visited Hassan's, the neurodevelopment lab, and we were like, we walked in, I do cognitive neuroscience, most of our students are in the psychology department, so we're not used to so many samples of what you want to study. And then we walked in, and there were flies everywhere, like in container, right? Don't worry, it was not like, but it was like million, I don't know, do you have a number? Like, it was like more than I could even guess, like I have really no idea if there's like 1 million, 10 million, 1 billion. It was like so many. It was like so surprising to see like the questions and issues you have when you are doing science in your field are so different, because we are studying different organs, and some of them are overlapping, some of them are different. Anyway, it was just to say that it's amazing to see how difficult it is to find 3 people with a focal lesion and a specific behavioral deficit, and on the other side, maybe 1 floor up or 1 floor down, or the room next door, there's someone that has 1 million of that specific sample. And I think that this is just about how complex the thing that we're trying to do is. It's not more complex than study the liver, or I think, right? Or the intestine. I don't think it's more complex, or I really don't feel like. I think it's just an organ like another one, and we have no idea how it works, right? But it's certainly beautiful, and I don't know, I'll leave it up there and kind of a tale, but just to fold in, see how different, right, the things that we're trying to do are, and how we all can kind of find difficulties or obstacles or challenges in what we're doing, right? How do we feel about this?
I think it makes me think about falsification. So you publish your 3 patients, and that's like the first record of it, right? And then it's like the job of science actually to falsify it, like find 3 more patients show the opposite or not actually, or find just 1 patient who dances out of the line, and then you learn something new actually about the lesions, like what they should, like what function is impaired actually and what function is not impaired. Like you get more specific. See,
that's
like
fair.
if you sample 3 swans that are white, and then have 1 who's black, and then you have to learn something. Like.
That's fair, but what it will falsify is maybe the conclusions that the author reached to, not the existence of that diversity, not the existence of that person actually had a deficit and a lesion, right? So what falsifies is not the existence of diversity in that person. So you maybe have just sampled in this distribution of stochastic stuff, you just sampled down here, right? And you thought that this was fantastic. It's not false. It's just that point in a distribution where the mean is maybe something else, right? So now how do we sample all the rest of the distribution in human cognitive neuroscience?
But I think this has happened quite naturally. I think the history of pharmacology is full of drugs that were used and somehow was a promised land wide spectrum. This is going to work for everyone to treat depression and so on. And you could see that through the years, MDs and MD PhDs probably they started to say, well, on average, this is not doing any good, or no better than just doing some exercise. However, for this specific niche of population, we have found that there is a cluster of responders for which this could be interesting, right? So I think I don't know if it's just part of sort of escape strategy to say we need to keep selling this drug. We know now that massively there are sufficient meta-analyses that show that the benefit is very limited when you put everyone in every type of patients. So let's try. And I think part of biomedical science these days, not the biomedical science I'm most interested personally, but it's about finding those specificities of the patients that might be responders to a specific type of drugs or interventions, right?
There you go. All right, so let's open up the floor. There you go. Or there's one from the back. Superpower. Thank you. And if you don't mind reminding us your name.
Yes, there's a button. My name is Vitali, and I have a question. And before the question, just a few comments to make it more clear for the question. So when you say basically that, so what you're saying is that we don't know how the brain functions, and it's a big philosophical question, Platonian, whatever, so just cut off this philosophy. And experimental neuroscience doesn't give us an understanding of why and how it works. So let's just see the consequence of its work. So, and then we can use the quantitative methods, we can use experiments, which we could use, but experiments don't explain philosophy, because you either believe it or not. So, but then, so I think this is where this like a variance, I can't say the variance is a norm. I could imagine that a variance could be a norm, which is, to me, is a little more to the truth. But This is where I think you go to another illusion, because then you only see the consequences of a mechanism which we don't understand, and then you see, okay, we see the attributes, this is how it works, this is what we see, we could do the experiments, we use MRI, whatever, but then you can never go backwards, since you avoid trying to explain how the mechanism works and why it works. Sorry, maybe this is the way I understood. Maybe my understanding is wrong of your words. And speaking about your the variance and the stochastic approach, and I think it was Taleb who very timely introduced this in a scientific discussion. I couldn't but remind you of Congress of Mathematicians in 1930, which is almost 100 years ago, where Kurt Gödel introduced his theorem of incompleteness, which basically states the same thing, that in an axiomatic system, there's always something which cannot be explained by the system, which is variance, stochastic, and whatever. So it has been proven almost 100 years ago. And even in mathematics, people try to avoid it because they like to be deterministic. Because if mathematicians are very uncomfortable acknowledging that mathematics is not deterministic, because that seems to them to be the idea of mathematics. So these are my comments, but my question is, don't you go for another illusion, trying not to explain or avoid explaining the why and how of the consciousness? Thank you.
I mean, yeah, regarding the comment, well, maybe I answer the question, and in this way I address the comments as well. So first of all, it isn't true that we can't go back to causal mechanisms and observations and back and forth, at least in certain, perhaps not, obviously not in experiments on human subjects, but in the plethora of animal models. It is actually possible to go back and forth and understand sort of at least from a rigorous scientific perspective, causal relationships between, say, brain activity and behavior and feedback mechanisms and so on. So it is also, I think, not entirely correct to suggest that that we have not gotten better and better and better at being able to make predictions from data and to either falsify or confirm those predictions in the history, particularly of modern science. So that would suggest that at least to the extent that things are being studied that are knowable, okay, by humans doing science, right? This scientific approach is the most successful approach at this point for understanding the world we live in, the universe around us, and so on. Now, the philosophical issue of is the brain able to understand itself finally? Because neuroscience is the human brain trying to understand the human brain, right? And so whether there are limits and questions of incompleteness, I mean, I don't know. And can we attribute what we see, or what I would argue is a fundamental feature, at least of biological systems, is to say stochasticity, to missing elements that we don't know about? Formalistically, the answer is yes. So if you look, for example, at Stephen Wolfram's, another mathematician, approach, although he writes a paragraph about how evolution works and clearly doesn't understand anything about evolution, but nevertheless, he does have these sort of rules, right, that follow. And one of those rules, one of many, absolutely deterministic rule called Rule 110 in that book, where you basically, so these are algorithmic rules, like starting from some input, you follow the rule, you get an output, and so on. The output, even though the rule is deterministic, from any given set of input, the output is impossible to predict except by actually doing the iterations, right? So this is the one example I'm aware of where unpredictability and variance in outcome can be the result of a deterministic mathematical rule. So from that perspective, if we live in a universe governed by Rule 110 or some equivalent to it, then you're absolutely right. We may mistake, quote unquote, stochasticity and variation due to the inherent unpredictability or full predictability of the outcome, when in fact the deep underlying logic of how the universe works, as Einstein would have it, for example, would have it, is in fact deterministic, right? I personally, and again, you're right, this is a philosophical choice. At some point we have to make one. I personally would rather use Occam's razor and say, if it looks stochastic and unpredictable, then the underlying rules that govern it are probably stochastic and not the other way around. And given that we can go back and forth, again, and you know, walk up and down scales of analysis as far as the brain is concerned, and actually make sense out of the data we are seeing, would suggest that this is an okay way to approach. Will it ever solve the fundamental philosophical question? Probably not. Does it matter? Is another issue.
Let me just turn this over 1 second, and I know we have a couple of questions to Tony, because I wanted to hear a little bit about your work on neurostimulation, right? So we're hitting on the spot of causality, right? Like changing the system and see what happens, right? Do you encounter stochastic processes in your RTMS, repetitive? How does it look to you, right? Like tell us a little bit how it works in general for our general audience, but also like.
I think if you look at the history of non-invasive brain stimulation, at least, it emerged as a way to cope with the variability of lesions. So we knew that by trying to associate lesions in certain areas of the brain and specific behaviors or subspecific contributions to behaviors, it was very difficult to come out with some clear patterns because all patients were different. And in fact, it is impossible to find two patients with exactly the same lesion. I would even dare to say, not even similar, it's impossible to. Therefore, neurostimulation and non-invasive brain stimulation, you know, was brought as a family of technologies able to, if you want, transiently knock down, bother, perturb a region of the brain and see how this brain would operate under this perturbation. Now, as it happens in every field, at the beginning, the community is highly enthusiastic, and I mean, we can slow down dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and, you know, have effects on certain types of memory and not others. We can manipulate attention. We can actually handle the brain directly from our will of manipulating, which is quite a power, right? And the community was very enthusiastic initially, but I mean, what we realized with time and with the huge handicap of these very small samples that we can actually end up working out, because our experiments take a lot of time and we never have more than 20, 25 subjects, so very difficult to account for this. And what we realize is there is a lot of variability effectively. So something that was initially not shown now, by definition, I think our community is really being very, I would say, very active in showing averages, medians, and so on, but also individual data. Now, the issue that we're getting into is that if you consider that any effect of stimulation or whatever treatment, any intervention might be by generate different effects because there is this individual variability that's all over, and you know, so on. In the end, it really put into question our job as a scientist, which is to find predictions. I think as a kid, what I really loved of science is the idea that I could find some sort of rule, probably very stupid rule, that, you know, that my snail that was bigger or have more saliva would be faster than my twin brother ones, right? For example, that if you don't feel that you can find any regularity. And I think it's, in a sense, it's like our job is over, our job as a predictors of the reality. However, in the clinical world, this is exactly what an MD does, what a medical doctor would do. Medical doctors can read a lot of literature about how but in the end they tell you, I have my own sense of how I need to treat this patient. Something that sounds very suspicious to scientists sometimes, but it makes a lot of sense. Let me just put a very small example. clinical trials, by definitions, are you do exactly the same thing on a population that is highly triaged out to be more or less homogeneous. But in fact, the same molecule, the same intervention, the same brain stimulation approach done on head number 1, head number 2, brain number 1, number 2, it's going to act differently. Right? So we would love, and we would have to customize, to individualize our treatments according to many morphological, functional, probably, aspects of each individual. But we cannot do it because otherwise it's not a clinical trial anymore. It's just therapy. We're treating patients individually, showing that it works. I mean, what I'm trying to put into the table is something that it's really getting imposed. It's obvious from the data. We have a lot of variability, even with 25 subjects. Now, but might it mean that we need to change the way we think ourselves as a scientist as far, which it was about really finding these regularities. It's harsh to accept, but I will do it if we have to.
That's great. All right. We have a question. Oh, you already have a microphone. Fantastic. What is your name? Yeah, the button. Told you there's a button.
I'm Yasna.
How are you, Yasna?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you.
My question is, what is not consciousness?
Okay. And who wants to go? Quentin, do you have the answer to this question? What is not consciousness?
So what is not consciousness? Well, like there are many different models of consciousness. So you can tackle the problem really from different perspectives. If you take, like, for example, the global workspace model of consciousness, it clearly says you what is conscious and what is subconscious, or pre-conscious and then subliminal, just below the threshold of consciousness. And basically the global workspace works like a theater. The brain is like a theater. There is a stimulus, and the more reverberation it creates, the more brain regions it basically recruits and is processed in from, like, visual cortex, for example, visual information. It goes in a dorsal and a ventral stream. And the more actually it recruits these dorsal and ventral stream regions, the more the stimulus becomes conscious. So that means that it wants what it is and where it is. Basically, you can say what it is and where it is, actually. That's it. And then there are different situations where this information is only processed locally because it's not strong enough, because perhaps you're distracted by distractor stimuli. And so the information is not yet unconscious or subliminal. It's there, it's processed in your brain. It's just not yet actually access to conscious telling where and what it is, actually. But if now you direct your attention to it, you can say it, actually. And that means actually basically that it is processed in various more regions than just locally, like, emerging from the visual cortex and then stopping, actually. And then there's the subliminal stage, where information is that shortly presented that even if you draw your attention please a little bit, place a little bit in, but actually you cannot consciously tell what and where it is. But your brain has detected it, and your body can react to it. And there's these subliminal phenomena, like subliminal motivation, for example, when people work harder for something they didn't consciously perceive, for example.
That's great. And this theory, just FYI, if you want to go read it back home, just a heads up, it's one of the theory by Stanislas Dehaene. It's called the Global Neuronal Workspace. It's one of the leading theories of consciousness right now. Check that out, GNW, Global Neuronal Workspace, GNW, and so on and so forth. But
actually,
right?
So this is just one model. There are other
Yes.
models actually about consciousness. But then you can also ask yourself, what does it mean to be conscious? So what does it mean to experience something, experience taste, for example? And this is more difficult actually to explain. So yeah, it's just, I wanted to add this.
Absolutely. So if you want to know what is not consciousness, maybe 2 cents that I have is simply think about all the scientists studying disorders of consciousness, right? So actually, very interesting, and about variability. The more earlier we had one term, right? You either awake or in a coma, right? Like it was very binary, awake or coma. And now in the past 20 years, even more, but in particular neuroscience has tried to distinguish what does it mean to be in a coma and who actually exits from this unknown state and who actually stays for long or too long. And actually they started adding, flavors to this condition. Some of them are called comatose patients. Some of them are in a vegetative state, right? Some of them are called minimally conscious states and so on. So what is not conscious? Well, certainly these patients have different ways than the ones we likely have in this room right now of processing the information around us, right? So just throwing out, there's more terminologies, and now my students hate me because there's a lot of terminology to learn, but it's just to tell you how to approach the question of consciousness. Well, last week some people does it through, they did it through sleep, dreaming, right? So losing consciousness because you're not sleeping, and some people do it through disorders of consciousness, and some people neurostimulating the brain all of a sudden, right? You present something, a stimulus that should be detected, but you do something to the brain, to the electrical activity of the brain that interrupts that process, right? And so therefore the patient misses information that otherwise will be, attended. That's one of the 2 cents. Do you agree with that statement?
Sometimes it's the opposite, like something that you don't see because near the threshold for consciousness that you have tested before individually in a number of subjects. We individualize sometimes some aspects of psychophysics, and suddenly under certain types of stimulation in particular areas of the brain related to the attentional system, I think Leah mentioned also the attentional system is very important, suddenly they become conscious. Now, the only way we have to record that consciousness or unconsciousness of that specific target is the fact that the subject can report it. And that's sort of unsettling in a sense because, the idea is the condition is that the condition for conscious, something that becomes conscious to someone, is this someone needs to report it as being conscious. I've seen it, and therefore it becomes conscious automatically. Seems kind of fragile, but a lot of experiments depend on that.
I just wanted to address something you said earlier about and I see where that would come from. This problem of sort of being too worried about variance to get to the point where you say, well, what's the point then of being a scientist, because where are the regularities and where are the rules? And I don't think that's the message that people should be taking, because the point here is that to look for regularities, that is to say for underlying rules, right, that would account for the generation of the distribution, right? So again, I like to use this as an example. It's not that it's biologically relevant necessarily, but of course, one of the most striking examples of in all of science is, the wave function equation of Schrödinger, right? So where you obviously have a deterministic, and even worse than that, a deterministic time symmetrical mathematical equation that nevertheless describes the unpredictability prior to observation of any given instance. Now, that's a rule, and it's a regularity. And it's a regularity about the inherent indeterminism and at least unpredictability of a subatomic particle. So that would, and there is absolutely no reason that you cannot find the same thing in biology. And once again, the one example, the one true example of what I would call a true theory in biology, right? And that is the framework and the foundational event of everything we do today is evolution by natural selection by Charles Darwin, right? Which, again, simple mechanism that you can explain by a few lines of language, because sometimes the best language is language, that actually explains the evolution of all of life on Earth, accounts for the means and the variations and the possibility of deriving future. So not only does it describe, it also predicts. It tells you precisely how new forms of life will form have formed in the past and will form in the future, right? So that means that the accounting for variation, the acceptance of stochasticity and noise and so on as being features of the world we live in, particularly of the brain we try to study, does not preclude, I would suggest, actually pre-informs our capacity to derive explanatory and predictive rules. It just means that our focus should not be the mechanism, but the rule. That is to say that anytime we study a specific mechanism, what we're studying is a single instance of a more general rule. And what we're after is when we study those famous 3 patients and some 5 patients in the future, and one there, is we accumulate enough evidence of mechanistic instances, and then hopefully we're able to derive a rule that explains why those different instances behave in different ways, right? So in fact, it makes our job as scientists more interesting, not more precarious.
That's what I was gonna say. Isn't it even more exciting we know that we're studying something complex, right? Like this stuff is complex, right? But knowing why it is complex is already one step closer, right? To the, okay, so it's complex because of this, right? Rather than knowing like it's complex and I have no idea where the complexity is coming from, right? Sometimes it seems like we may be one step closer. Then in 20 years, we're gonna be here and be like, we were wrong. No, I don't know, but be like, okay, it was complex, but it was actually more complex than the complex we were thinking about. And with that, we had another question. Someone else, oh, Alexis, there you go. Here, there's a microphone. This is much closer.
Do I have to? Okay. So hi, I'm Alexis. This is kind of about like the variation, but also the non-invasive brain stimulation. So if like behavioral variation is based in like natural and spontaneous like variability in our neural circuitry, do you think that the emergence of like non-invasive brain stimulation almost like poses a threat to biodiversity in a way, or a threat to like the natural variation that you would see because we're able to almost alter the neural circuitry itself? So would that cause us to think differently about like normative models in general?
That's awesome. Awesome question.
No, it's a very good question, of course. I guess the response would be depends on the parameters of stimulation that you use. In general, the idea just to make you feel very safe if you ever come to our lab and you participate in our experiments, which it happens all the time with the students, with ourselves, by the way, is that the parameters of stimulation that we apply they play with the natural flexibility, plasticity, elasticity of the system. Therefore, that there is a leverage for connections via synaptic plasticity to be modified by stimulation in an artificial way. I take that for granted, that's a reality. And that the system will come back to its initial state after the experiment, short after the experiment, sometimes very short after the pattern that just was delivered, right? Of course, this is an assumption, taking into account the type of measures that we can do, which is based on the SAPE cognitive task that we use to verify that an effect has happened and an effect will be reversed shortly after. There are no accounts at the parameters that people have been using non-invasive brain stimulation to study the brain in healthy subjects of the anatomy itself, the structure or the function being changed irreversibly. And therefore, when I refer to these effects, I always try, it's not even plasticity, it's elasticity. It's something that gets modified like a rubber band, get its intention and then getting released. The system oscillates for a while and then rapidly it comes back to the original state. And we benefit from that window of opportunity in which this rubber band is getting somehow oscillating, modifying until it comes back to its initial state to show that there is some sort of causal relation between the stimulated region and the function. I think that would be the principle.
Yeah, but there's a deeper notion to the question, right? So what you're suggesting is it's not, there's nothing to worry about because of the way we do the experiment, right? I think the deeper question is if we could do it some other way, right? If we were to exploit for negative purposes or whatever, right? Would there be a risk of homogenizing, right? Responses, behaviors, etc. If someone were to, in some science fiction-y, but perhaps not really, future, be able to do brain stimulation on people walking in the street and make them all, the sheepdog and the sheep, and you all go into this place. Would that be a risk if it weren't being done with the kind of
the
care?
technology was there to be sufficient, even efficient enough to generate very meaningful effects. Yeah, theoretically the risk is possible, is there, yeah. Now, if you ask me, it can be done with the current, I would say, technologies or concept, or are people actively pursuing this type of agenda? I might be unaware of that. I don't think it's the case, but of course the world is big, and there are a lot of armies working on plenty of very joyful things for the future. So I hope not.
I don't mean to be like dystopian and like apocalyptic, but I guess because like non-invasive brain stimulation can have like a very positive like clinical future with treating things like, I don't know, like addiction or like depression or like disorders of like the frontal lobe where it's like a deficit in executive functioning. So my thought process was, if this becomes like the most effective, most common treatment for certain disorders like depression or substance use disorders, where a large portion of the population deals with it, could we be potentially eliminating variation that we don't even see the benefits in yet? Because sometimes like you don't notice like the benefit of the outliers or of the people that might be thought to have like deficits until there comes a time when that deficit is the most important thing. So I don't know, it's a very broad question, but yes, I was thinking of the more deeper thing.
So I would like to suggest that if what I'm proposing, and not just me, many others, is correct, that in other words, that the very mechanisms of life, right, are definitionally stochastic and noisy, then that eventuality is impossible by definition. Why? Because in fact the variance is a question of scales. So first of all, there is nothing you can do about the fact that thermodynamic behavior of molecules inside cells, which eventually drives whether a neuron is going to respond or not respond or whatever, is noisy. I mean, it's thermodynamic noise, right? Secondly, there's nothing you can do about the fact that every brain has developed a different architecture of the same circuitry, a slightly different architecture of the same circuitry, and that throughout life, plasticity events, but also random noisy stochastic events like random cell death, for example, will alter the architecture of a given network. And then there's nothing you can do about the fact that the probability of an action potential, that is to say a neuron to fire to activate the next set of neurons, is a stochastic process. And so on and so forth. And now you take that to every level, and then feedback and behavior and so on. So yes, you can shift the mean. And we can do the types of causal experiments. That's why we get that mechanism, where even by doing higher order selection for behavior, right? So for example, in flies, because we have millions and because we have control over what they do and so on, you can take two flies that start from being a genetically homogeneous population, and you can select them for a specific kind of behavior, right? And then breed them, collect the progeny, take among the progeny, the ones which are now even more genetically identical than what you started with, right? Because it's a single pair. And you select again for that behavior. And you do that iteration over tens of generations. And in every single generation, from the first to the 10th, you reproduce the entire variance of the behavior of the starting population, right? Now, you go into their brains and you say, okay, is this variance that I see in behavior reflected in the variance in the brain, or is this like stochastic behavior? And it is actually reflected in the brain. So even at the level of how a neural circuit develops from the exact same genome, right? It develops according to a set of rules that will produce. Now what you can do is pass these populations through genetic bottlenecks. So actually not select them for being behaviorally different, but select them for being genetically different to begin with, right? So this population has a certain genome, this population has a certain genome. In each population, all the individuals share the genome. What do you see? You see when you do that, you shift the mean of the behavior, whatever the behavioral parameter you're using, right? But what you don't shift is the distribution around that mean. So from the scale of the molecules that play a role in the formation of the brain, to the scale of how the brain forms, to the scale of how the brain is activated, to the scale of behavioral feedback and learning and so on, you have this variance at every step, which means that no matter what you do, right, no matter how much you try to turn people into sheep, you will always have the rebels, and the rebels will always induce the change in the future. And so that is why, philosophically even if you were to put science, actually, if this turns out to be the reality of biology, as I am convinced it is, in fact, it's a more hopeful way of thinking about the world and about us as people and us as a society than determinism might be, because you're absolutely right. If determinism were the rule and we figured it out, then we can homogenize everything. But if the underlying nature and fundamental rule that governs all of life is noise and stochasticity, then that's the rule, and there is nothing you can do to homogenize it, because anything you do introduces further noise and stochasticity.
I have another thing to add on this, actually. If you think about, for example, like these first patients with depression you implanted with DBS electrodes and had like these amazing effects, patients reported that they feel like better, like as if a door opens and they get out of their ruminations, of their internal negative world, and it's as if a new world starts, actually. The thing is that now, I don't know when this was, like maybe 10 years ago, when Helen Merberg in like depression today, we still don't have actually a treatment that works. So we cannot just implant every patient and it will work. So in some patients, there are always patients who stay treatment resistant. So there are actually many of them, like 1 out of 3 patients don't respond to standard monoaminergic antidepressants, which is like really astonishing. That could mean that the monoaminergics don't work. It could mean that DBS is maybe not always the good reason, the good thing for each patient. But it also means basically that people are very variant, actually. They vary in their treatment response. And that's the challenge of diagnosis and treatment of MDs, actually find the treatment that works for this patient.
That's a great point. That was exactly the point they were to make about pharmacology, right? Like somehow we saw this, right? We thought that pharmacology was going to, homogenize or control, or like we're gonna give this pill to everyone and they're all gonna behave in this way, right? And it didn't really work out, right? So maybe we can learn from this example to see like it is more complex. It is more complex than if it's impossible. Maybe I get that. I get the layout of why it could be impossible, but certainly what we tried up until now, it didn't get even closer to any of those. Yep. There's a microphone over there, or I can launch it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Gabriella. I'm an undergrad at Columbia College. My question is kind of, I guess, Professor Spagna, you were starting to talk about it more so with the implications of kind of this work, and I was very intrigued by the idea that there isn't, like the brain doesn't exist, because I think in all of my classes when we learn about different, like neurodiversity, it's always like what happened in this brain that makes it kind of act differently, like what are the mechanical differences, what are the behavioral differences that we see, and kind of then to the conversation about about flies and like this development. Do you guys think that there'll be a difference in how we approach like neurodevelopment in like children? And if, this atypical brain doesn't really exist, like, is that going to impact, maybe our educational practices, or for children who may have been seen as like neurodiverse or have like different neurological differences, kind of how we're going to approach that, how we're going to think about that, maybe even if there is treatment, or how that might, I guess, like just kind of change that in the future, because I think this is very quickly, rapidly evolving.
If there is a lesson to be learned, it is exactly that. That is to say that we need to think from the perspective of neurodiversity. Now, this is not to minimize that everything remains a distribution with it's not a flat line. It's a sort of a Gaussian distribution, which means that there's an aggregation of a majority of samples of whatever it is you're looking at around a certain mean, and that there are exceptions on both ends for any given phenotype, right? Nevertheless, an instructive example is that if you start, for example, with looking at simple parameters to measure, like reading speed or ability to do arithmetic in preschool children, you will find quite a bit of difference between them. That you find that in at least when there's a good educational system, by the age of 8 or so, those differences disappear. So again, the plasticity of the brain, the ability to add this layer of learning on top of what you're sort of innate. So you'd have kids who are innately less prone to read fast or read well, or read, but then education helps them. Now, what we should not minimize is that around this sort of Gaussian distribution, there would be extremes where whatever happened during development resulted in a brain that it has great difficulty in dealing with the world around it, right? And in fact, producing the kinds of behaviors that would make it beneficial for this individual to interact with the world and to interact with society. What we have to be conscious of is that where we describe this sort of thing about being able to produce the kinds of beneficial interactions with the world and society is very much also determined by society, right? And the example I like to give is maybe a little easier to think about the world prior to putting ramps for wheelchairs, right? Wasn't that long ago. When there weren't no ramps, people who clearly have no, let's say, neural issue of dealing with the world, right? Nevertheless, had no access to many opportunities for physical architectural reasons. You could say, well, the old word used to be handicapped. Well, in fact, they were handicapped by society. Sure, they can't walk, but there was a solution to that. Technology invented the wheelchair. Yet society did not adapt until a while, right? So now if we think about neurodiversity from that perspective, we are obligated to think, what can I do as a society, what can I do as an institution to facilitate the interaction of people who may be not neurotypical, for lack of a better term, in order to actually allow them within the confines of who they are as individuals to have the same productive, beneficial, positive for them, interactions with the world and with society. This will still mean that there is a small group of individuals who, unfortunately, had, for genetic or environmental or whatever reasons, issues with the development of their brain that would make that, even if you were to make social conditions optimal, right? There is just a problem of processing sensory information. Severe forms of autism spectrum disorder, for example, in small children, right? If you just can't process what the world is giving you and cannot produce an action, right? There's not much that can be done from that perspective. But I think it's very, very important to think about it from this point or perspective that you're raising. That again is only meaningful if we consider that there wasn't meant to be some idealized brain to be achieved. There was just meant to be a functional brain that deals with the world's input and produces behavior as an output, right? And the least we can do is move the world towards that brain, right? To the extent that is reasonable and possible, so as to give as many brains as possible opportunities to thrive, you know. Does that address your?
So we're going. I'm gonna throw another thing in the middle, and it's like, so maybe all our very well received attempts at doing like diversity, equity, and inclusion in society came from the wrong angle of like, oh, we must have XYZ because, but didn't. I don't know, maybe it's not that they came from the wrong angle, but they are not really thinking about this neurodiversity as part of our conscious experience, that all our conscious experiences are diverse on their own, right? So rather than thinking, oh, my company must have like a diverse equity and inclusion panel and a very diverse body because so it's a good company, it's more like just because I want to have a workforce in my company that represents diversity, because diversity is what it is about. Like what diverse workforce will produce whatever the objective is that reflects better with society, that moves the environment or the world closer to diverse brains and so on, right? So maybe we kind of addressed or tackled the issue from the end point.
Well, I mean, there are two ways of thinking about it. The first is to say, well, I want to do good, whether I do good by coming from here or coming from there, as long as I end up doing good, that's a good thing. But you're right about how do I then harness this good I created beyond ticking boxes for, you know, whatever, you know, political. And maybe a way to put this in a metaphor is to imagine that you have a buffet in front of you, right? And you look and you kind of can guess about what food you might like or might not like and so on. And you have two strategies, and you say, well, the safe way to go is to eat those little tiny pieces, because I know that there's just, you know, assuming you're not allergic to any components. Anyway. And that's my safe strategy, right? And sure, that'll work for you, right? The other way to go is to say, well, let me sample everything first, and then decide what works and what doesn't work, what I like and what I don't like, right? Now, transpose this on a social context, political context, professional context, whatever. If you want to know, if you want to harness the full potential of a population, right? Are you better off taking majority from the mean of that population and saying, well, I know they will do good enough and that's good enough? Or are you better off if the full range, if emergent properties of the interactions between individuals, right, have a completely different character when those individuals are more diverse versus less diverse, then by definition, your better strategy, your selfishly better strategy, is to sample diversity and ask what happens when a greater diversity of components are allowed to interact. Because what we know from both science and basic experiments to society is that the emergent property in society, we call that culture. The emergent property of a diverse group of people is always richer, more interesting, and more open to future possibilities than the emergent properties of the interactions of less diverse components. So I would say science has provided evidence for the fact that this is the correct reason why you should, say in an employment approach, encourage diversity, because there are unpredictable emergent properties from the interactions of the individual components. And you're, by definition, having a richer sampling of those emergent properties. And that's true for the brain, by the way, right? Otherwise, why aren't all neurons in the brain exactly the same? I mean, if it's all about one neuron firing to activate another neuron, why should there be molecular level, morphological level, physiological level diversity in neurons? Because presumably evolution figured this out, teleologically speaking, right? The generation of diversity itself is a motor for higher order emergent properties. that are more interesting than the properties of the components themselves.
That is a great answer. Do we want to give some concluding remarks, or we have more? I see like some are trying to, but don't be shy. Okay, we're going to take these. Do we have time? Can we hold our 2 more and we go? Off we go. There you go. And tell us your name. And that's coming.
So my name's Haroon. I'm in the neuroscience program with Professor Spagna. So I had a question on what your scientific definition of consciousness is. I know the philosophical one is really messy, and I know the scientific one is too, but I'm a little kind of confused by my previous experience in neuroscience of what entails consciousness within neuroscience. Specifically, I wanted to give an example of emotions, and I was wondering why emotions are considered their own realm when emotional experiences are very relevant to conscious experience.
Okay, I go. So my definition of consciousness, well, in the beginning when I first started out studying this phenomenon, I was positioning in the global workspace model actually, because it was very reassuring having this framework and then having different experimental conditions where I could study it, like subliminal motivation, for example. But then actually, and I kind of stayed there actually for a long time. And then last year, we had this panel discussion again, and Thomas Antrion was saying what he's reading right now, this book from Anil Seth, it's called Being You. And so I became curious, so I was starting to read it too. And basically, what it gives you is actually, he tackles the problem almost like the heart problem, what it means to be conscious, as said, what it means to see the red socks of Tony, the redness of these socks, how red are they for me than for you actually, and how can we tackle this heart problem, which is very conceptually very difficult to tackle. And then he comes out with theory that it actually comes from the body, and these interoceptive signals actually play in your experience, the way you perceive or experience the world. And then he sends the whole book around it, so it's a good reference actually to get started into this topic of what it means to be conscious. Yeah. This is a whole other topic. What is emotions actually? So what is emotion? So I'm not somebody working on emotion. I'm working on actually what does it mean to label emotions on faces, for example. But this is basically just saying, is somebody happy, sad, but doesn't really touch us at the point, the emotions you feel actually, you the meaning, again, the experience of it. And so then you're very fast actually also in this topic of affective states that can fluctuate over the course of seconds, perhaps even milliseconds, you can, no, not milliseconds, that would be, but it's actually a question, actually, how fast, but it fluctuates. Let's say the course of your day, your affective state or mood is not the same, in the morning or in the afternoon, at midtime, at lunchtime. So this is pretty interesting, actually, but it's not emotion, it's an affective state. But if you conceptualize emotion as an affective state, then it becomes interesting because you can model it also mathematical, because you can present people with feedback, for example, good and bad feedback, and then see over the course of 40 trials, 80 trials, how the fluctuation in subjective mood ratings can be predicted by the feedback, by the memory of the trials before, the fatigue effect, and so on. And then you have hidden variables you can actually access, and then you are in the variability again, because this varies across people, it varies across diseases, diseases like depression, where it perhaps fluctuates less, and this characterizes perhaps one of the experiences of the disease, being depressed. So I'm getting very broad actually here, so I don't have a clear, straight answer to your question. That's, I guess, what I'm saying.
Okay, let me jump in. Do fruit flies have emotions? Do you see I'm pissed, or I'm calm today, or no? Do you see anything or that you can kind of?
I don't speak fly, so I can't ask them that question. But it does touch on something perhaps more important. I mean, one of the things that are serious mysteries, right, is that many of these issues of, say, consciousness, or at least self-awareness, for example, you know, being aware that you're aware, right? It's one definition of consciousness, is, you know, being aware that you're aware. Questions of free will, right? Do we have free will? Do we not have free will? And so on. Emotions, right? Describing affective states by some meta phenomenon that we refer to as emotions seem to be human-specific features. So not feeling, but this kind of, you know, making a big deal out of it, let's put it that way, right? Yet there is nothing about the structure or the chemistry of the brain from whence emerges what we would like to call self-awareness, free will, and emotion in the higher order sense of it, that is human specific. I mean, we know that these things can be affected by chemistry that is common to all. So then it's a deep mystery as why would it suddenly emerge in this one particular species, right? Why do we sit around asking, what is consciousness and am I free, right? When in fact, for most animals, the sense of agency may be enough, right? The sense that if I act in the world, I mean, primates, cats, I'm sure even, are aware of the fact that if they act, there will be a consequence to their action, and you can see that in anticipation. You know, an animal will act and will anticipate that the world reacts to its action, suggesting that the sense of agency is present. Now, agency is not the same as free will. Why do we bother thinking about, why isn't agency good enough for us and we want to have free will and so on? At least some of us want. So that to me, and I don't have an answer, that to me is the deep mystery. And so sometimes I wonder, you know, the extent to which this massive expansion in our neocortex, particularly the upper layers of the neocortex, isn't fundamentally a storytelling device. That is to say that what our brain has done differently than the rest of even our closest cousins is, excuse my French, make shit up. It's come up with ways of making stuff up. What we tend to call secondary rationalization. That is to say that creating a story about why you do the things you do, why the world is the way it is, and why, etc. And that is essentially the foundation of all culture, of all civilization, of all, you know, making things up, telling yourself a story about, you know. And sometimes I wonder whether those notions that of course I'm not suggesting the study of emotion, consciousness, and free will, I don't know, cannot be scientifically rigorous. I'm just always struck by the fact that scientific rigor always leads back to kinds of chemistry and brain organization that are not unique to humans. So either being conscious and having emotions and free will in the sense that we humans define them is not unique to us. And in that sense, a fruit fly or a mouse or a chimp or a bonobo has all of those things, just doesn't talk about them. To our knowledge, maybe they talk about them among themselves. Or it's just totally made up. It doesn't really exist. It's a mechanism. It's an emergent property of the human brain. There is nothing special underlying it. It's just this emergent property that, and yet it's so fundamental that it governs our lives, and it's, I don't know.
Yeah, actually,
I know I'm being very controversial.
Last year, actually, we talked about this zombie story.
Language as well. Emotion can be a language.
Well, language, the language of language, the one we're using right now, is exactly part of that emergent property of telling stories, right? Nevertheless, one should, of course, say that this type of language, not perhaps this kind of super sophisticated verbalization, but certainly vocalization accompanied by gesturing and changes. You'll find that in gorillas and chimpanzees, and just as much as you find it in humans.
But you can also find it in artificial intelligence, these chat boxes that can chat with you. Actually, you ask a question and it answers you. And even the algorithm that plays Go, it really plays Go. Like it really tries to play the game and can be even quite original, like almost like a human in it. Like, or surprising, let's say surprising. But it's an algorithm, so it's not conscious, right? Or is it a zombie, actually? Is it like this idea of the zombie
Philosophical
we discussed
zombie.
last year?
Yeah. Well,
We get to that point because actually, I think it was yesterday night, Alfredo threatened us with some questions he was going to ask us, which he didn't exactly. And I think one of them was, what's the future of consciousness? What do you think? What do you think the field might be going, and why do you think it's important? So I was actually, trying to come up with something that might sound minimally interesting, and I really thought that one of the things that for me seems a real challenge for the future is machine consciousness, right? Machine consciousness. So do we believe that these algorithms, under whatever form they are presented, it can be ChatGPT or it can be a robotic form that probably want to be more appealing to our emotions. Do they have consciousness, but with the minimal rules to requirements actually to call these conscious machines or not? I don't have a response at all. It's just maybe Bassem has some comments.
No, that's a great point. So you know what? We're gonna make a bet. We have to wrap up, but we have a lovely reception outside where we can ask even more questions to our tired speakers. But I'm gonna throw a challenge, which is like, we're going to be in 12 months back here, exactly in this room, more or less, with the same people, and we will have time to talk about what happened in 12 months about artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on. And I really don't know where we're going to be right now. I can't really tell. What say you?
Well, I don't know. I can't predict the future, because if I could, I wouldn't be here. But I think my intuition is that there are two fundamental differences that are key to for lack of a better term, biological intelligence. The first is that it's, for the time being, embodied. I don't think it makes sense. We like to think of our thoughts and brain and so on as if the rest of the, I think, the brain without the body doesn't make any sense. It's, and the second thing is that it grows. It isn't put together and then learning comes in and then, the way artificial neural networks currently work. And my intuition is that, my sense is that this process of growth, particularly through selective mechanisms, because by the way, Darwinian selection as a principle also operates on much shorter time scale. It's not just generation, it's biological growth itself is Darwinian. We can discuss that next time. And my sense is that somehow that is key to the kind of natural intelligence that we observe and its operative mechanisms. For better or worse, by the way, its biases and its all the bad stuff it produces, right? To all the unbelievable stuff. And as long as artificial intelligence does not have that combination of algorithmic growth in order to arrive at some steady, quote unquote, steady state, and that algorithmic growth being disembodied, right? Then there will always be some criteria by which you will recognize the difference. If artificial intelligence arrives at solving those two problems, then I think again, this is all speculation, then I think the boundary will disappear and we will live in a completely different kind of world. Yeah.
Lian, what say you? What do we do with this?
It's already brilliantly said. So
concluding remarks.
I feel like it's like, if we can solve this, wouldn't we be more important actually to solve how the brain works? Like what is natural intelligence? So wouldn't this be like a more purposeful thing to do than developing an algorithm that behaves consciously. But that could be a model too. But anyway, like, no, we want to know how the brain works, and when it's diseased, what we should do, right? And for that known, we need to know what natural intelligence is all about. But maybe some part of the answer can come from artificial intelligence. It's not black and white.
I may add something very, very shortly. Some months ago, my son asked me to help him with some recommendation letters that he needed to write to a conservatory of music. And I told him, like, make me a draft, and I'll help you after you've done a draft. So he made a very nice draft. So, well, let's do something now, Marius. Let's use ChatGPT to improve it. And the guy, 18 years old, I'm very proud of my son, and he says, no, we shouldn't do that. This is not ethical. And I thought that, okay, that sets up a difference between artificial intelligence and still, at least the intelligence of my son. There is some sort of moral sense, maybe completely absurd moral sense, because we get used, we get helped by plenty of tools. He believed he shouldn't do that. It was some sort of set generating an unfair advantage, and he wouldn't. So show me something.
That's a great point. All right, I'll see you all again in 12 months, and we'll see what kind of world we're living in, okay? Thank you again so much for our speaker.